Hi, Anna and Bob.
Hello.
Hey,
How are you?
Very well,
It's always-
thank you.
It's always so nice to see you.
And you too.
So for people in the audience, Anna is in the UK, so it's 11 o'clock.
Yes, that's correct. It's just after 11 in Oxford.
And Bob is in Oklahoma now, right? Not in San Fran.
Norman, Oklahoma, USA.
Oh, God bless you. But notice the shirt, special for us.
I'm a homeboy. I'm from Boston, so
Boston.
We're thinking of sending the Red Sox down here.
Did you hear? Carl said we're thinking about sending the Red Sox down to you.
yeah, I watch every game. It's a pretty rough season, but I lived through the 80s and the 70s and the 60s. So,
And you're still here.
yeah, they're still my team. They don't look that good this year, though. I got to be honest.
Bob actually told me when we checked in earlier that he could see the lights of Fenway Park from his grandmother's apartment
From her house in Roxbury.
or house.
My grandparents lived in Roxbury. They had a 3-story house, and so I could see the lights of Fenway from my bedroom window when I was there. So,
It's pretty special.
well,
Okay, I'm
Fenway,
trying to work around sunlight. What?
Fenway is a special place.
And you're a special guy. Okay, you think? Oh, okay. Oh, lost. I can just, I don't know where I am now.
See
I don't know where
Joyce
I am now.
now?
Did you see me at all? They can't
See.
hear.
Yeah,
You can hear?
Yeah,
Okay.
all fine. Perfect.
all
Yeah.
good.
You're in the light.
Looks like you're having a lovely sunny day.
Yeah.
The sun will move. It's good. It's all good. Welcome to our conversation with Bob Ingersoll and Anna Scarnà here at Stockbridge Library, giving us an opportunity to reflect on their book, Primatology, Ethics and Trauma, the Oklahoma Chimpanzee Studies. I'm Joyce Butler, and I'm proud to host this event with the sun, with Bob and Anna, and who have worked to bring the narrative that has been hidden to this point. Thank you, Wendy Pearson, for your support in organizing this event. Let me introduce these two lovely people. So this is the text from which I will read. Bob Ingersoll has been a tireless champion of captive chimpanzees since the 1970s. He entered the world of primates as an undergraduate student at the University of Oklahoma Institute for Primate Studies, where the research focus was on cognition, language, and interspecies communication between chimpanzees and humans using American Sign Language. He quickly came to see the chimpanzees as friends rather than research subjects. After several productive years, funding for the program was cut by the university, and the chimpanzee colony was sold to a medical research laboratory for invasive research. This led Ingersoll on a crusade to free his chimpanzees friends that had lasted, and this work has lasted for decades. Anna Scarnà is a psychologist and neuroscientist with expertise in language, personality, and psychological disorders. Her doctorate was on the composition of the monolingual and bilingual lexicon, and she explored the factors that affect object naming and reading. She has conducted award-winning research into non-drug treatments for dopamine in bipolar and schizophrenia at Oxford University, United Kingdom, where she runs courses in brain and behavior neuroscience, personality and psychological disorders, covering topics including personality traits, addiction, and social behaviors. She teaches various international tutorial courses and has been running the popular Oxford University online Introduction to Psychology course. It is always interesting to me to observe how our lives intersect. We can be on different continents, working on similar interests without even knowing one another exists. And through a unique set of circumstances, we are brought together so that we can combine our efforts and strengthen our work through this collaborative effort. Anna and Bob's work is an example of how we are so much better together. Bob and Anna have been blessed to experience this unique connection. They found each other through a circuitous route, which we will soon ask them to explain. Their collaboration resulted in this powerful book on the ethics and trauma of chimpanzee research. Bob has been based in California, Oklahoma, and Florida, working directly with the chimps and monkeys, advocating for their rights. He has achieved amazing feats by creating emotional and physical safety for these animals. Anna has been across the pond, based in the UK, exploring and analyzing the same animal research with her students within the university classroom, but from the outside looking in. They each have a unique perspective on this work, and by combining these perspectives, the story is told with a depth and insight that only they have. Together, they make a fabulous team. They are thoughtful human beings working to make a difference. Their intellect and their hearts benefit us all. So just to frame the event, I will ask questions to Bob and Anna for about 45 minutes. And given the fact that it's such a small crowd, if anybody has a question, you should feel free to jump in. I was going to wait until the end, but I would say, since it's such a small crowd, jump in if you have questions. And thank you for joining us today. We're thrilled you're here to learn more about this work from these two leaders in the field. You guys ready?
Yep.
Okay, roll. You both were on separate continents, yet on a similar trajectory in your quest to learn about chimpanzee research. Can you each talk about your personal interest regarding this work? And in that process, can you share how the two of you connected with one another and how this bond became so strong so quickly, allowing you to co-write this book? And you can duke it out between the two of you. Who asks? Who answers?
We tossed a coin. We tossed a coin already. So I'm going to start. 1 minute I was watching a film about a chimpanzee called Nim Chimpsky. And I was watching not just Bob, but as you know, Joyce, you were in the movie too. And you and Bob stuck out as people who supported Nim. And I knew I had to help somehow. This was in 2014. That's when the movie came out in the United Kingdom. I was already familiar with that work from my own undergraduate degree as a psychology student. I had learned about Nim Chimpsky, this chimpanzee who was taught how to sign. I was taught this as an undergraduate student when I was in my 20s. And then I did a PhD. My PhD was on bilingualism. It was on how we attach linguistic tags to words and ideas. And I have a personal interest in this because I am actually Italian and my parents came to this country without knowing any other language. And I was raised in an Italian community. I didn't learn any English until I started school. I started school a little bit later when I was about 7 or 8. So I've always been interested in how beings attach labels to ideas and objects. And also how we read those words aloud, but that's a separate issue. So when this film came out, I was enthralled by the things that went on. And for many years, I taught little clips from the movie on my, you mentioned the online Introduction to Psychology course. I would guide students and direct them to watching the movie, and we would discuss things like, can animals learn language? Is this really language? And then one day it struck me, actually, learning language is not a binary concept. It's not that you can say, yes, this is language, or no, that's not. Because even human beings, when we know language, we don't always use it. I don't walk into a room and say, there's the ceiling, there are the walls, there's a window, there's the floor. And it struck me that actually we've been looking at this incorrectly, that perhaps rather than consider this a group of studies on language, actually what we should have been thinking about was the trauma that was endured by the process of two beings bonding, where one of those beings was a human and the other being was a chimpanzee. And I didn't realize at the time that there were other chimpanzees. It wasn't just Nim Chimpsky, you know, that he was given this fabulous name in order to be kind of memorable, but even that seemed very salacious, and it didn't kind of make sense to me. So it took me a long time. It took me until lockdown, the end of lockdown in July 2021. So we've nearly celebrated our 2nd year anniversary of working together. It took me nearly 2 years to get in touch. I was very bored one day, and I thought, I know, I'll find this Bob Ingersoll guy on Instagram. I just joined Instagram because that's what everyone did during lockdown. You know, we used social media. And I checked in to find him. There were lots of Bob Ingersolls because there's a famous philosopher from the 18th century of the same name, Robert Ingersoll. But I found something which was a picture of a paint box with some brown paint and a little bottle of Tabasco sauce. And underneath it said, I'll never forget this, it said, I was clearing these things out from my garage and it made me cry because I remembered that I had kept them in my garage because they belonged to Nim. And so I posted under that and I said, oh, you know, this is, I've been teaching your stuff for many years and you should know that it's touched a lot of people. And as we know, as you know, Joyce, I then got in touch with you after some time to say, actually, you know, this movie has touched a lot more people than you can ever imagine. I had a lot of students coming through in one way or another, empathizing with the plight of Nim, because that Project Nim just told his story. It wasn't even a film about the academics. In fact, there's a lot missing from the film, which I think is one of the, but films are made for different reasons. Anyway, that's a different reason, a different thing. But I hadn't realized there were other chimpanzees like Washoe. So Bob, over to you.
Well, I came to be in the chimpanzee world in 1975 when I had Roger Fouts as a professor of introductory psychology, and I heard about finding chimps, Washoe, at not other chimps, but just Washoe as an undergraduate, and luckily my first day of school at the University of Oklahoma, which happens to be about a mile away from here, is the football stadium, which is what OU is known for, football. But I attended this class, and at the end of the class, Roger Fouts talked about working with Washoe and sign language with chimps, and I realized, wow, this is the guy that works with Washoe. So after the class, after he handed out his syllabus, I went up to him and said, how do I get to work with you? And he told me, and I did the couple of things that he asked me to do. And that was a Monday morning at 8:30, right? First class. And on Wednesday afternoon, I had gotten a TB test, which was one of the requirements to be around the chimps, is that you're TB negative, because they're susceptible to upper respiratory and especially TB. So, and in primatology, one of the things we do is get a TB test every year so that we don't, inadvertently infect our monkeys or our chimpanzee charges and the animals we have in sanctuary with TB. So on Wednesday afternoon, I met Nim Chimpsky's older brother, Ali, and another chimpanzee named Vanessa. And on that day, I realized that I didn't want to be an orthopedic surgeon anymore. I wanted to be whatever it was that got to do this, which was to hang out with chimps. And it was, I can't really explain it. I think Anna actually explains this a little better than I can explain it. I don't know why, but I knew I was a chimp, and I knew those chimps were, I just wanted to be around them, and I couldn't quite figure that out. And to be honest with you, until Anna and I met, I hadn't really kind of put it all together about exactly what it was that drew us together. And when I met Anna and she asked the first question that she asked in her class, which I did a Q&A in, a light bulb went off in my head, and I'm like, wow, she's really put a word to what it was that I was trying to figure out, and it's the word trauma. And the reality is that I was a traumatized individual all my life, and when I met the chimp, not only were they traumatized as well, but between us, I think that there was some sort of understanding that we needed one another for whatever that reason might have been. And if you've seen Project NIM, I think it's pretty obvious that it wasn't really obvious to me, because of course you don't self-diagnose, but it was obvious to a lot of other people that one of the reasons I was there was because I was getting something from the chimps, not just the other way around. So it just worked out, and I continue to work with chimps all the way through, well, now, up to now. And so that's how we came together. And I think Anna can kind of explain what happened next, because once we got together, then things moved quickly. As soon as we did the Q&A in her class, it was one of those, there's something here, I don't know quite what, but I want to reach out to Anna and see how it goes. And I'll turn that back to you now, Anna.
Thank you. So we can have the next question.
Yeah, you don't want to respond to Bob? You're good?
If we have the next question, I'll respond to it in that question.
Okay. So why did writing this book become so important? Or maybe how also? My instinct is that you each had a strong drive to share this story based on your different perspectives, and that perhaps the need to tell this story became even stronger through your collaboration. Can you please share your thoughts on this?
Yeah, well, after I posted on Instagram, after I found Bob on Instagram, I said, look, I've been teaching your stuff for a long time. And he kind of ignored me at first. And then I said, look, my students at Oxford University are on your course, on the bit on language, and they're learning about, other animals. Irene Pepperberg is a famous psychologist who had a parrot who was also taught language. And I said, Alex, the parrot, and also Nim, and eventually he saw it, and he invited, he offered, very kindly offered to give my students a question and answer session, as he's just explained, to talk about some of the issues. And he said, look, rip up your questions, we'll just ad lib, but you kick off with the first question. And so finally, I felt I was able to share with somebody what I was watching on the screen, which was not just the care that was given by this particular human to that particular chimp, but also the capacity of that particular chimp to give that care back. The bond between two sentient beings and what's carried in the non-verbal space. The fact it was like a bidirectional bond that existed. I think you had the same with Nim. That he knew where he was with you and with Bob. And in fact, I did go through every single person in the film and think, who do I contact? And by the time Bob and I, so Bob has just talked about how quickly things unraveled. I asked that question about trauma, and at the end of the session, he wanted to speak to me, and he said, look, I've been waiting for a long time for somebody to tell this story. I was not aware there were other chimpanzees. Bob has already referred to Washoe. Washoe was a female chimpanzee, and she's on the front cover of our book. So that's her there, and that's Bob looking like he's a very tough researcher with Washoe, with his back to the camera. And it was really extra important. In fact, we say in our book, Washoe is the kind of star of the show in our book. Even though it was Nim who brought us together, we felt that the story of Nim was told in the movie to some extent, but there were some other really interesting things about Washoe, which I hadn't noticed, I hadn't realized. I only realized as a grown-up, I didn't realize as a student that these things were happening, because I didn't really understand what was going on. I think it takes age and maturity. I realized that Washoe was incapable of becoming a normal mother chimpanzee to a baby chimpanzee. And she had a couple of babies, but the second one was particularly important because she actually ended up killing her baby. And to me, that was a very big question. If these chimpanzees are instinctive and work on their instinctive features, then that really was a very messed up thing to do. What led her to do that? And the more I heard Bob's stories, the more I realized that this book should take the form of some of those stories, a little bit of reportage, but add it to the literature on trauma. There's a lot of scientific work on trauma that has been done since the chimpanzee studies of the 70s and the 80s and 60s. And with Washoe, I pointed out to Bob, she was always going to be incapable of mothering, because she witnessed how she came to be in Oklahoma was particularly important. She was born in Africa. She witnessed her mother being killed, and she was about 9 months old when she was taken away from her mother. Now put yourself in that position. If it was your mum and you were the human in this, maybe people have told you this happened to you, or maybe you have some instinct or some memory even. There is evidence in humans that they have very good memory for trauma. So she witnessed her mother was taken away, put into I can see I was breaking up. She was put into a crate and ferried across to the States, where she was held in the Holloman Air Base lab. And we don't really know what happened to her there. We only know she was given the name Kathy, and we know a little bit about her weight and what her diet was. So all these things considered, I ended up opening lots of research and speaking to lots of people about Washoe and about some of the other chimpanzees. Washoe's baby, Sequoia. Bob has talked about Nim and Nim's brothers, Ali and Onan, and there were other chimpanzees. I was so surprised to learn. And then I realized that each of those chimpanzees had an identity. Each chimpanzee had a past and an essence of being. And I felt that we had the obligation to put these facts forward and to treat each of those chimpanzees with dignity and with respect. And so that's how we came to do it. We actually ended up, we didn't mean to. In fact, we're only just realizing now that what we actually did was to write our book undercover. We wrote it in 6 months without telling anybody. It was very much a book that wrote itself. And we didn't tell anybody because we knew that Bob's version of the events, he was present. He has a diary of the care of a particular time that Washoe went through. But his experiences were suffocated, or they were silenced. And so we realized that we had to write this book without telling anybody. So we were very, very quick to put it together. But we analyzed hours and hours of footage. We opened up discussion. We evaluated past studies. We interviewed other people who were involved in those studies. Some of them who really had reason to share their traumatic experiences of looking after chimpanzees with us. Others who were connected in other ways. We interviewed Noam Chomsky about Nim Chimpsky. Yeah, it all came together very quickly. So I hope that answers the question. Yeah, why did the book become so important? It became very, very important to share those facts and those details. And we even say in the book, make your own mind up. We're not trying to sway anyone. We're not trying to sell a book. We even say, don't even bother buying the book. Borrow it from a library. You know, we want these facts to be told with accuracy and with transparency. So over to Bob, if you have any thoughts to add.
Well, I didn't know I was looking for Anna, but I was looking for Anna for 40 years. I'd turned down a lot of other opportunities. A lot of other people wanted to write books about me or do movies about me. And I realized this isn't about me. I'm lucky enough to have had to experience those chimps in a personal friend kind of way. But I knew that there was a lot more to it, and the truth about what was actually going on was not presented to the public in a way that the public could kind of get a real understanding of and I didn't put the word trauma on it until Anna actually said that. But I had said some things in conferences and in talks that I'd given in the past about there was something fundamentally wrong with what we were doing. I just couldn't quite figure out a term or the scientific background for that. And I knew that there was a person out there that could do that. And then when Anna asked that first question in that Q&A, I'm telling you, a light bulb went out in my head, and I'm like, this is the person. She knows this stuff, and in just a few weeks, we became friends. Anna and I became friends, and then it became one of those. I have a lot to say, and we're gonna work through this. And Anna is an incredible scientist. Every single one of those conversations is in a notebook. There are notes about every single one, all the way back to the first meeting we had, and that also told me that she gets this. This is something that we need to be able to present in a way that is clear to the public about what actually occurred, and about language. Is this language? Is this communication? And she had all the neuroscience and the language background for that. And I had, a lot of experience with a lot of different chimps, because over the years I've come to know 150 chimps pretty easy. I probably know 75 chimpanzees by name, and they know me as well, because I've spent quite a bit of time with a lot of chimps in various situations and sanctuaries, and as pets, and in labs. So yeah, Anna was like, she came down from heaven pretty much and said, here I am, let's write this book. About 3 months in, she said, hey, let's write a book. Let's propose, we'll submit a proposal to a publisher and see what happens. So there you go. That's
Nice. Nice. I can never hear that story too many times. On page 13, you ask, what did this research teach us? It is important now to consider what we have learned from the experience and to retell the stories with the correct details in order to do justice to the animals and to act with integrity and dignity toward other beings. Can you elaborate on this thinking, on this quote?
Yeah. The first thing that the research taught us, I had been studying language in a very dry lab. When cognitive neuroscientists do language, they collect a lot of data on reaction times regarding how quickly people can learn names of objects or read words aloud. And part of that, I also developed a computational program. So we developed like an artificial intelligence model, and then we lesioned it to pretend that it was like having a stroke or having a brain injury, to see how language was learned and how language fell apart. And one of the things that came up is that there are a set of variables, a set of factors that affect human language learning. One of those is the age at which you acquire a word. Another one of those is frequency, how often you use a word. For instance, the word apple is named faster than the word armadillo because you learn what an apple is. An apple is less complex to look at. You might see more apples in your life. You probably learn to say apple very early on in life, but armadillo is a little bit more complicated. And those same factors, I was thinking, well, what happens with the chimps? Who are they learning from? And the first thing that I learned by marrying the chimp work with my initial PhD work after so many years, whoever gives us language is responsible for our flourishing. We say this in the book, and I had never considered the emotional aspects of that language learning experience, because in my lab, when I was doing my PhD work, it was all very unemotional, it's all very cognitive. And suddenly it became clear, we now have a script for trauma. Years on after this work, there are biological studies on brain and stress. In fact, in my own laboratory in psychiatry, many years after my PhD, we were taking saliva samples and looking at stress hormones when people were watching football matches or when people were giving a speech in public speaking. So if those things can alter your brain chemistry and alter your stress hormones, imagine what being in a cage does if you're an animal with whom we share 99% of our DNA. And so this suddenly became, it opened a box of questions. What about this bond between sentient beings? What are people bringing of their own life experiences to these studies? It became very clear that actually all those researchers, Joyce, you and Bob, you were very, very young to be doing these studies, to be looking after another sentient being. And I think James Mahoney says it very well in the film Project Nim. He says, animals born into captivity are born into tragedy. And once we thought about that, wow, you know, Bob could go home, or the other researchers could go home at the end of the day, but those animal participants, those chimpanzees, were stuck behind a cage with no wrongdoing. They had done nothing, and they didn't know how to get out, and they didn't know when their next walk would be, this sort of stuff. And so we started to say, Bob and I started to think about, who is going to own this? Nearly 50 years later, who is going to say, look, I put my hands up and these were not things we should have been doing? We didn't know very much about chimpanzees in those days. But you could probably tell this story better than I can, Joyce. You did the research. But had we known what we know now, probably those studies would not have been conducted in that way. Well, we know for a fact. Yeah, no question about it. But also there were bigger issues. And the more I spoke to Bob about this, the more I realized this is actually a bigger story, because if we are prepared to treat beings with whom we share 98 to 99% of our DNA with, what hope is there for how we treat each other as human beings? And you can't really do this work without considering your own place on this planet. And so we would have these conversations and I would think, wow, I've got to change the choices that I make in my family. So I stopped eating meat. I mean, I've been through vegetarianism before, but I started to think about, what am I buying? Where is it coming from? Who did what to whom? Because in a way, that's kind of what language teaches us. We also started to think about things like the rewilding projects. There's a very big trend recently, sort of most recently, to think about, where are we on this planet? Where are we on this earth? What are we doing? And other things, for instance, language is really a representation of physical location on the planet, of geographical location, but that can be a little bit arbitrary. The Spanish that's spoken in Colombia is a lot more like Italian than the Spanish that is spoken in Spain. And yet Spain is closer to Italy than Colombia is. And so in a way, sometimes geographical location is arbitrary. We kind of became the story that we were talking about, because we didn't even meet when we wrote this book. We just did it all through platforms like this. In about 6 months, we had a full manuscript. 9 months, we submitted the manuscript. 1 year on, we published the book. And if you can do that, then really where you are located doesn't matter. It's the narrative that you're given. So I can't reiterate, the biggest learning curve has been, whoever gives us language is responsible for our flourishing. Over to Bob.
Well, in around 1979, I happened to be out, and the facility, the Institute for Primate Studies, is actually about 3 miles east of here where I am right now. And I was out there getting ready to come here to my air-conditioned nice house with, you know, whatever, all the amenities of me having a house and a home and all that. And I got in my car, and the 5 or so chimps that I had just taken on a walk were all lined up. I think that picture is actually somewhere in Project NEM. And you see all of them looking at me getting in my car, and it happened to be a 1960 Alfa Romeo, which I was particularly fond of at the time. And I looked at them, and I had an epiphany. I'm like, wow, I get to go home, and they don't. They're all from various backgrounds. Some of them were born here in Oklahoma at the Institute. Some of them were expats. A couple of them were wild caught, which was still going on when I first started working with chimps. That didn't end until the early 1980s. And you know, I had studied chimpanzees now for up to then about 4 years. So I'd learned a lot about chimps, and not just about the signing stuff, but about chimps in the wild, because I was on a quest to find out as much as I could about chimps, not captive chimps. And I guess that at that moment, I realized captive chimps are different, real different. But I didn't really know how to put a finger on it, but it bugged me from then on. And up until I met Anna, it was part of what bugged me. Joyce and I have known each other for a long time. And I think that Joyce knew that there was something burning inside of me that I couldn't quite get out. And when I met Anna, I realized that she was the place that I could offload a lot of this stuff, and she could make sense of it, and make sense of the trauma, not only that I went through, but the chimps went through, and kind of presented in the way that we're presenting it now. And that's why it's a beautiful thing to have met Anna and not have to even met her in person until after the book was done. It's been a remarkable friendship, to start that way, and now to be as close, I think, as we are, based on just this little screen here, because I was sitting here in this house a lot, or in Florida, or in California, and she was in Oxford, or at the beginning, actually, she was in Scotland. And so
Yes, I was on the boat.
this has taken a lot of interesting turns, and it does, I think it represents the good parts of the technology that we're now using, and it represents how much more we could do if we opened ourselves up a little bit. That day, I drove home, and it bugged me ever since. I gave a talk once at a primate meeting about that very thing. I got to go home, and they didn't. And several prominent primatologists 2 years later came up to me at that same conference, but 2 years later, and said, Bob, you said something 2 years ago that I still remember. And this was a extremely famous primatologist. And he said to me, it never occurred to me that fact that we get to go home and they don't. And I think it's a sign of how we now view animals completely differently than we did in 1975 to 1979. And I think in 1979, I was feeling those pressures that, wow, we're really doing something that impacts a fellow being in a way that is not to their advantage. And that bugged me. And that's why I'm 45 years into this, and I'll do this until I die. Today, I was actually working on behalf of some monkeys that I happen to be associated with a monkey sanctuary in Oklahoma. So I take this very seriously, and I feel, as Anna said, a real responsibility to do the right thing here as best I can. That's one of the reasons why Joyce and I are as close as we are, because we had a similar experience when I got to see Nim again, but that's a whole nother story. Maybe Joyce will kick in on that a little bit and tell that, but I'll stop now and let Joyce ask the next question.
So Bob, I just want to follow up with you on that. So we both entered into this young, naive, with the best of intentions. And as we know, the best of intentions are not good enough. Like,
no.
That's the lesson that we've all learned in this, as well as other things. But we created, when we were with them, life was good.
Great. It was the best time of my life. I say it in Project Nim.
But I mean, for them too, for that, like, except for the cage part. I didn't have to do the cage part, but so there were parts that were okay. And so clearly that one time when you were driving home and you said, this is wrong, you must have had another couple of opportunities that helped shift your thinking traumatically to the traumatic event of the place closing down.
Oh yeah.
And the chimps being sent off. So that must have been like, when did it really change for you when you said, oh my God, I'm going to take up this charge for the rest of my life?
Well, I think I realized that this was a big story, and that it was bigger than me, and that I was going to be involved in it. I did not know exactly where it was going, because during that period of time, the language research had been conducted in a way that opened itself up to severe criticism. And because of that criticism, the funding for this research was cut. And therefore, there wasn't any money to house the chimps. And so there was a scramble amongst principal investigators to be able to consolidate and continue to stay in academia. But the chimps, for the most part, at least almost all of the chimps I worked with, ended up in a medical lab in New York. And at that moment, when I first met Jim Mahoney, he, as I say in Project Nim, he came out to the Institute for Primate Studies out here from the place called LEMSEP, which is the Laboratory for Experimental Medicine and Surgery in Primates. And it's just as scary as it sounds, because my friends were about to go to jail, and that jail was going to include invasive medical research on my friends who did nothing to deserve it. And up until that point, they were celebrated in the New York Magazine and in Life Magazine and all these places, and Rolling Stone. And I'm like, what is up with this? We're just going to let this happen? And so by around 1980 or 81, I'd had enough of the language stuff. And none of that mattered to me. That stupid argument about whether it's language or communication, or whether we are mimicking or they are mimicking, or whether they initiate or whether they do sentences and all that sort of thing. None of that mattered to me. I knew they were communicating. I knew they could do, they could do phenomenal things with language. I think that got discounted because we were looking for sentences and grammar and moving the goalposts about what a good result would be. And to me, you just couldn't send these chimps away to a medical lab and just wipe your hands of it. And so I didn't know exactly what to do, because I was only 26 or 27, 28 years old at that time. And I was taking on a giant university right here. And so over the years, fortunately I was able to do this and continue to do it with the support of my friends and my wife and a lot of other people that understood that I think I was right, that what we'd done to those chimps was wrong. And so over the years, I continued until finally things changed. And Elizabeth Hess came along, wrote the book, Nim Chimpsky, the ape who would be human. Then shortly after that, Project Nim came out. And, I mean, I could go on for hours about this, but the reality is that it took a long time, and the advocacy was not fun. I've been thrown on the ground by police on campus on football game day for handing out pieces of paper that talked about the chimps, because they didn't want to hear about it. And those are the kind of things that, the university was done with it, and they didn't want to be criticized by some little hippie guy that thought he was, being righteous or whatever. And I didn't care what they thought. I talked to every single university president when we had new university presidents, and over time, I think I gained a following. I had a business here. We ran a radio station show, and so those are the kind of things I did until Elizabeth Hess came along. But it wasn't exactly what I had intended. I don't think that was necessarily what I would have done. And what we're doing now, I think, is more along the lines of where I wanted to go, because I think it was a more, I don't exactly know, maybe Joyce, you can weigh in on this about Elizabeth's book and James's movie, but they certainly helped. But I think that in order to teach this in a proper way at an academic level, appropriate for this, it's someone like Anna. And no, it's not just someone like Anna, it's Anna. And that, to me, I feel about as lucky a human being as possible that came along, because I think Joyce and I both realized that there was something missing from both of those treatments. Elizabeth's book, and no offense to Elizabeth at all, I love her. I think she did a huge service to the chimps, but it wasn't exactly enough. And the movie was, it really did a good thing, but it didn't do enough. It didn't tell, like Anna says, the story of the other chimps, the ones that no one knows about. You don't even know their names. There's a chimp named Kelly. There's a chimp named Abigail. There's Nim's mother, Carolyn. There's other brothers and twins. There's so much more that didn't make it to that, because it wasn't, it wasn't important to the principal investigators or the journalists or whatever. And I just didn't want to let that go. And so I didn't.
I'm going to follow up with a question with you. You talked about, you knew they were signing. How did you know that? What happened? Can you give us some examples of
Boom.
how you knew? Yeah, you. I'll jump back to Anna in a minute.
Oh, yeah. Well, immediately, as soon as I didn't know any signs at all when I was with chimps, but I saw what was going on, and in no time, I went to signing classes and this and that, but they would, well, I'll give you an example. I didn't have a name sign because that didn't come up. I mean, I think that you guys probably did a little bit more formal training and all that sort of thing when you were at the beginning of the NIM project, but I didn't have a name sign. And one night I was with Washo when she was about to give birth, and we were holding up items, what we call, holding an exemplar and asking, what is this? And then they sign what it is, like a little plastic cat or like a teapot. What's this? And it's a teapot, and or it's a drink or whatever. And so one night we were doing that, and I signed, who are you? Which is, what's your name? Name you, to Washo, and she signs Washo. And then we're, hanging out. It's, late at night, and she's horribly pregnant, not horribly pregnant, but painfully pregnant. You could tell it was painful. And she was, and I felt for her. And so she signs, name you. And I'm like, I can't name me because I don't have a name. And she signs, name of you is Bob. And that's the sign for black. And at that moment, I realized, wow, cool. Washo just gave me a name sign. Now, that didn't seem as significant to me as it did to Anna. And when Anna came along, and we've talked about this a lot because there are a lot of aspects of this name thing that come up in our book. And when Washo named me, that kind of changed the game. And I'm going to let Anna kind of take over here because there's also a painting that is involved here. Later on, Washo did a painting, and there's a W, clearly a W on this painting. And this only happened about a month and a half, maybe 2 months ago, when I brought this painting to Oxford for an event we had. And while a couple of days before the event, Anna and I had the painting, we were talking about it, and Anna said, well, what's the sign for Washo? What's, and I went, it's like this behind the ear. It's like a W behind the ear. And Anna said, well, look at this, look at that. And then it was like one of those aha moments. Now I'm going to let you talk about that, Anna.
The reason it was an aha moment was because when I was doing my PhD, I was looking at what happens when you start to learn an object's tag. And what happens when you learn faces and you learn people tags, in other words, names. And the fact that Washo had learned or had given Bob a name suggested that he was a significant person in her mind, but also meant that she could think about him when he wasn't there. And that is one of the bases of separation anxiety in children. It's one of the bases of learning how things exist and coexist. So I know if I take some sunglasses and I put them under the table, they do still exist, but I can't see them. And I can talk about them. I can say, where are those sunglasses? Because I'm able to tag them. And so that suggested to me that she had some kind of attachment. The fact she could, I think the painting is called Name, isn't it? Or
yeah, Name. I asked her, what's this? And she signed Name. And so I wrote.
She signed Name. So she knows that "wa" is her name, is part of her name. So these would be, in a human child, they would be the beginnings of reading and writing. And I don't want to make that parallel because it's a kind of a human arrogant parallel to be making. It anthropomorphizes those chimps. It makes them more human. And they're not human, they're chimps. That's the whole point. They're not typically developing chimps because they were highly uncultured. In other words, they adopted human habits because they were raised amongst humans and by humans. Was it that the chimpanzees became more human-like, or was it that the humans were becoming more chimp-like? Perhaps both. Does it matter? Maybe it doesn't matter. So this was why that part of the signing was important. And something else, I was asking Bob about this again last month when he came over. First of all, Washo taught other chimpanzees to sign. She was given an infant, Lulis, to look after, and she taught him to sign as well. So that's the equivalent of my parents teaching me their language and me teaching them my English back. So they taught me their native language, Italian, and I taught them the English I was learning at school back to them. And we were in England. So it's very much like a human model would be. And then there was a third example, which was with Nim, actually. Bob, you told me that Nim, at some stages, you embarked on a little project to see whether Nim could teach someone who is naive of
Yeah.
signing, Dave Autry, a member of your lab, whether Nim could teach a human sign language rather than just the human teaching the chimps sign language. So it's bi-directional.
That was very shortly after I met Joyce. So that was probably only a few months after Joyce brought Nim back to Oklahoma, which would have been September of 1977. So I'm saying September, probably November or so of 1977, we pulled this off.
So Nim taught the humans just as the humans taught Nim, and not just Nim. In the project, in the film Project Nim, James Mahoney clearly says, he's the vet in the LEMSIP lab, he says several of the Oklahoma chimpanzees came knowing signs, knowing sign language, and we humans had to learn what they were telling us. And so we made these signs up with the things that they were saying. And the signs that the chimpanzees were using were words like out, key, walk, shoe. The fact that these chimpanzees had been taught to sign by humans, but now the other bunch of humans were being taught by the chimps and had to learn pretty quickly to be able to communicate with the chimpanzees that they were vaccinating in the medical research laboratory. So I hope in a way that we've explained why language is important, but also why it's kind of almost unimportant in this chimpanzee model. The fact that there was a lot more going on behind those studies than could have ever been explained in a film or in other books. So we hope we've made those ideas clearer.
I think part of the reason that it's never been explained, it's because it was the peons on the ground doing all the work. And if it didn't fit into the lexicon of what the big boys wanted, we were disregarded and poo-pooed and shut down and silenced, right? So that's, I said that earlier in the introduction, that the power of your work now going forward is, now, I should say now with this book and going forward, whatever we all do, is that it feels to me like, particularly for Bob and I, we finally have the mic and we can speak to the truths that should have been highlighted. Shameful that they were not, makes me crazy. And such a disservice to the cognitive abilities of those animals and how they were bilingual and how they did bridge the gap between two genetic makeup. And at least from my perspective, because I only know Nim, it was seamless for him and easy, and he led the way. So the power of this and why I'm excited about it and happy to host a talk like this is that the research studies that are out there feel very inadequate. That's the nicest way I can say it.
Well, the rules changed as they went along, and they had expectations that they were going to get this or that. Instead of how real science works, you don't have expectations of what you expect to get or what you want to get. You just get what you get, and you analyze the data in that way. These principal investigators, they knew what they wanted, and when it wasn't working, they changed the rules to fit their needs in terms of their results for granting purposes or to gain money or whatever, and which was completely unfair. Changing the rules in mid-game is just not, and unfair.
It's possible. It's possible that the researchers, the principal investigators, were working with a limited toolkit, emotional toolkit for what was going on. Because not just because of the research kind of grants and all those aspects, but Also, they had dumbed down the abilities of the chimpanzees. Nobody had ever considered that chimpanzees might already have their own language. And by teaching them sign language, they were becoming, as you say, Joyce, bilingual. And we know now from new research that's been done in field studies, so it's not even invasive, just putting up cameras and watching families of chimps in their natural habitats and analysing the phonemes that they use with each other. We know that chimpanzees already have a version of their own language. And this consists of something that looks like dialects, things that look like accents that they understand across species.
So how
people have done
unfortunate,
mathematical modelling.
how unfortunate that we missed that opportunity.
Yeah, absolutely.
You know, it just boggles my mind. So
We also
Yeah.
did
But
not
on the other hand,
we didn't understand that chimps understood verbal language, not just English, but Japanese primatologists have demonstrated that chimps that are in Japan and work with Japanese researchers understand Japanese. Our chimps that are here in the United States have been shown to understand English, and I think other languages have also been, so we underestimated the abilities of the chimps dramatically.
and we were so egocentric that we didn't even look beyond that ability to really bridge and find out what was going on. I mean, I think that you and I probably did that and other people did it, but we didn't have enough power. We didn't have letters after our name. We didn't have any money. Like we were messing with the system. And so shut them down is kind of the best way to do it. So I'm going to ask you both one more question because we're getting close to 7. Oh, it is 7. Last question. What is your greatest hope that people will take from your book and how it will impact thinking and behaviors?
Okay, shall I start, Bob? Is that okay?
Yeah, please do.
Okay, well, I think we've explained why trauma is in the title. I think we've explained why ethics is in the title. It has been 50 years since those initial psychological studies, and I think we all agree they must never happen again. But we're left with this kind of conundrum. What do we do with the material that is there already? Like every other famous study in psychology, these studies must not be swept under the carpet. They must not be forgotten. We still talk about Milgram, we still talk about Zimbardo, we still could talk about the very famous unethical studies that people did on humans. And there is no reason to neglect the fact that the same studies, same types of things that were unethical were done on chimpanzees. So it's time to reconsider that work, to take ownership for the things that were done, and probably most importantly, to preserve the memory of each chimpanzee who was used as an experimental participant in those studies, and to give them back their dignity so they did not die in vain.
I could not agree more. And my long-term goal was to have those chimps that no one knew about recognized. I worked with so many chimps that no one ever heard of ever, and they got left behind, and that broke my heart. I love those chimps as much as I could love a human being, and still to this day miss them badly. I've had some of those chimps in this house, and that's why I still have this house. One of the reasons why, anyway, is because it's extremely important to me to remember that we shouldn't forget them as, well, I call them people. They're people to me, and I called them people long before. Now it's cool to call chimps people, but when I was in graduate school, if I used that and I said my people, my graduate instructors and my co-students, they weren't having it. Now they not only do they have it, they're like, you were right all along, Bob. Like, yeah, I know. And thank God for Anna. And Joyce and I have had a extremely long friendship that I think started the day I saw Joyce with Nim in September of 1977. And it was heartbreaking because you could tell the love between Nim and Joyce was real. And the Grateful Dead have a song, and one of the lyrics is "Love is real, not fade away." And that love is real. You can see it in the film, and you can see it in Joyce's face right now. It mattered. And one of the reasons why I think it's very important to have this book and for someone from the outside to come in and help us is because it's important for this story to be told. And Anna is, I could not think of a better way to have done this. I'm most grateful to Anna and for all of her friends, all of the support we've had in the UK, and from our publishers and from our friends along the way. It's an honor to work with both Joyce and Anna, and I I don't know. I do know. I love these guys so much. I can't tell you.
I just wonder if there's any questions from the audience before we let Anna go to bed, because it's midnight now. Oh my gosh. Question.
I don't know if it's a question, but I'll ask you what I'm saying is accurate. So it occurred to me, Ham is the name of a monkey, or I think a chimpanzee actually, that led the U.S. space program. So that
Ham.
Ham.
Ham, I know what happened to Ham.
But
Little background history. Ham was retired to the North Carolina Zoo, was not on display, and so he lived his life out with other chimps in the back, in a back area at the North Carolina Zoo, and he was cared for by a man named Les Schobert, who was the chimpanzee tag representative, which is the taxonomic advisory group. So within zoos, they monitor families and where chimps are going to, unfortunately still zoos move chimpanzees around in order to keep breeding and have the DNA and their all of that. But unfortunately there are some issues with that. But Ham lived out his life fairly well after the space program thing.
I just had one comment. Anna, you had mentioned Milgram's study, as it were. I'm pretty sure, but not positive, that Ted Kaczynski was in one of those studies. And Ted Kaczynski, the Unabomber, died, I think, last week. And it just made me think, the trauma that the chimpanzees have been through. This is demonstrated at the human level as well. And the subjects of Milgram's test, it was just incredibly traumatic. So I think there's an interesting parallel there.
Anna, I think the question, and help me if I'm misrepresenting it, is that with Milgram's test and the trauma impact of those tests and how that perhaps influenced, what was the Unabomber's name? Ted Kaczynski. Do you want to speak a little on the Milgram tests? Or
Well, I'm not an expert in social psychology, and certainly not in the Milgram studies, but I do teach about Milgram. And I don't know about the Unabomber. I can't make any comment about that specifically, but certainly there's a lot of material from the participants from those original experiments in 1963 and 62, and they still reported up until a couple of years ago feeling traumatized by the things that they'd been led to do. So it's not surprising. I don't know of this chap whether there were other personality or other factors involved, but if that can affect those human participants to that extent, then I'm not really drawing parallels in that respect. I was drawing the parallel in the historical respect, that we have a duty to remind people that this was how psychology was done in those days. It's not that everybody was out to get these chimpanzees and do horrible things to them. It's that people were working with a limited capacity for what was considered ethical. And we can put Milgram in there. We could put Zimbardo. Zimbardo still talks about his study too, and how that messed up a lot of individuals. And I think probably Zimbardo would hold his hands up and say it messed him up too. You know, that even the people who were conducting these studies were affected. I mean, we saw this because we invited the original principal researchers to speak in our book, and we told them that we were writing a book, and we asked them if they wanted to contribute, and we didn't get any reply that they wanted to do so. So I can only conclude that these sorts of experiments messed up a lot of individuals in those times.
Okay, did I do okay with the question? You want to qualify at all, or you're good? Okay. Well, it turned into a nice discussion. Thank you. Anybody else? We're good? Okay. Thank you both. It's
Thank
always
you.
lovely
Thanks
to
for
see
inviting
you.
us. And you
I look
too.
forward to
Thank you for
seeing you.
inviting us.
Hey, thanks, Joyce. I got to do a hometown show. That's pretty
You
cool.
did, Bob.
I know all about Stockbridge. I love Arlo Guthrie. I know the whole song. I could sing it right now, but I won't. And thanks. You know, it makes me feel I'm at home, even though I'm not home, because although I've lived here since 1975, home is still Boston. My family still lives in Quincy and Dorchester and East Boston, and Boston will always be my home. Go Red Sox.
Thank you both. Lovely to see you.
You too, Joyce.
Look
Thanks.
forward to seeing you.
Thank you.
Bye.
All right. See you
Bye.
later.
Bye.
Okay.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye. Have a good night, Joyce.
Thank you.